A farm hoe, sharpened like a razor, sliced through the Mississippi night air and severed Master Cornelius Blackwood's head with a single precise blow. The skull rolled down the stairs of the big house while the body collapsed like an empty cotton sack, jets of blood painting the imported mahogany boards. But this was not the only death that night of July 23, 1857. Before dawn, 7 more people, including the sadistic overseer, the master's firstborn son, 2 visiting planters, and 3 drivers, lay mutilated across Blackwood Manor Plantation in Wilkinson County. 8 brutal deaths executed with surgical precision by a 34-year-old enslaved woman named Dinah. A woman who for 2 years was forced to participate in the most perverse human breeding experiment ever documented in the Deep South, attempted crossbreeding with animals that left her body destroyed and her mind shattered. But Dinah did not break completely. She just waited, observed, planned, and when the time came, she transformed every farm tool into an instrument of justice. The hoe that decapitated the master, the pitchfork that impaled the overseer, the sickle that dismembered the son, the same tools she used to serve became weapons of a revenge so brutal it terrorized all of Mississippi for a decade. This is the story that American history books never told. The story of Dinah, the woman the monster of Mississippi fatally underestimated. Wilkinson County, Mississippi, in the summer of 1857, was a landscape of contradictions. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, their white bowls representing both immense wealth and unspeakable human suffering. Blackwood Manor Plantation sprawled across 2,300 acres of prime delta land, worked by 147 enslaved people whose bodies were considered nothing more than agricultural equipment. The plantation produced over 400 bales of cotton annually, making Cornelius Blackwood one of the wealthiest men in the county, with an estimated net worth of $87,000. A fortune built entirely on stolen labor and broken bodies. The social structure of Blackwood Manor reflected the brutal hierarchy of the antebellum South. At the top sat the Blackwood family in their Greek Revival mansion with its imposing white columns and wide verandas. Below them, the white overseer Marcus Thornton ruled the fields with systematic cruelty. Beneath him, 3 black drivers, enslaved men promoted to positions of power over their own people, enforced the daily quotas with the desperation of men who knew their elevated status depended on their willingness to brutalize their brothers and sisters. And at the bottom, 143 field hands and house slaves who worked from can't-see morning to can't-see night, their lives valued only by their capacity to produce profit. The plantation sat 5 miles from the town of Woodville, the county seat, where wealthy planters gathered at the Wilkinson Hotel to discuss cotton prices, slave management techniques, and the growing tensions between North and South. The Blackwood family attended services every Sunday at Grace Episcopal Church, where Reverend Thomas Whitfield preached that slavery was God's divine plan, that Africans were the cursed descendants of Ham, destined to serve their white masters. The same reverend who blessed the Blackwood family never questioned why so many enslaved women bore children with suspiciously light skin, or why screams sometimes echoed from the big house on Saturday nights when the master entertained guests. Mississippi in 1857 existed in a state of paranoid tension. The state had passed increasingly draconian black codes following Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia 26 years earlier. Enslaved people could not gather in groups larger than 5 without white supervision. Teaching a slave to read was punishable by 39 lashes. Any black person found off their plantation without a written pass could be whipped by any white person who encountered them. Slave patrols, called paddy rollers by the enslaved, rode the roads at night with bloodhounds and shotguns, authorized to use any force necessary to maintain the system of terror. But beneath the surface of forced compliance, resistance simmered. Songs carried coded messages. The Underground Railroad had secret stations even in the Deep South, though the journey to freedom from Mississippi was nearly impossible. Conjure women and root workers practiced African spiritual traditions in secret, mixing Christianity with older gods, preparing poisons from native plants, keeping knowledge alive that masters feared. Every plantation had its whispered stories of slaves who fought back, who poisoned cruel overseers, who escaped to the swamps and formed maroon communities, who chose death over submission. Into this world of systematic brutality, Dinah had been born 34 years earlier on a smaller plantation in Adams County. She never knew her father. Her mother, Patience, whispered that he was a Fulani man, sold away before Dinah's birth, a blacksmith of extraordinary skill whose hands could shape iron but couldn't break the chains that bound him. Patience herself was a woman of fierce intelligence and quiet dignity, who taught Dinah in whispered late-night conversations about their people's history, about the kingdoms of West Africa, about the Middle Passage that had stolen their ancestors, about resistance and survival. Dinah's childhood was marked by the casual cruelties that defined enslaved life. She was put to work in the fields at age 6, her small hands learning to pick cotton without damaging the bowls. She watched her mother receive 50 lashes for the crime of learning to read from a discarded newspaper. She saw her Uncle Solomon sold away to a slave trader for the offense of looking a white woman in the eye. She learned early that survival meant making herself useful, keeping her head down, storing her rage deep inside where it couldn't be seen. By age 14, Dinah showed unusual aptitude with animals. She could calm spooked horses with a touch, coax milk from stubborn cows, heal sick livestock with herb poultices learned from her mother. Her master at the time, Thomas Pemberton, recognized her value and trained her as a veterinary assistant, a role that gave her slightly better treatment than field hands, better food, a separate cabin, freedom from the worst physical labor. For 16 years, Dinah lived this way, treating animals with more care than most masters showed their human property. But in March of 1855, Thomas Pemberton died of a stroke, and his estate was liquidated to pay debts. Dinah stood on the auction block in Natchez, 29 years old, advertised as experienced in animal husbandry and breeding, healthy, good teeth, compliant temperament. She sold for $1,200 to a buyer she'd never seen before, a man whose eyes held a coldness that made her skin crawl even in the Mississippi heat. That buyer was Cornelius Blackwood. Cornelius Blackwood was 53 years old in 1855, a man of medium height with steel-gray hair, cold blue eyes, and the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a day in his life. He was born into wealth, the third son of a Virginia planter family who'd moved to Mississippi during the cotton boom of the 1820s, where his older brothers inherited the family's original plantation. Cornelius used his portion of the inheritance to purchase prime delta land and build his own empire. But Cornelius was not content with mere wealth. He fancied himself a scientist, a man of modern progressive ideas about agriculture and livestock improvement. He'd read Charles Darwin's early works on animal breeding, studied bloodline management in horses and cattle, attended lectures in New Orleans about selective breeding for desired traits. His library contained over 300 volumes on agriculture, animal husbandry, and what he called racial science, pseudo-scientific texts that claimed to prove white superiority through skull measurements and fabricated biological theories. Cornelius believed he could revolutionize slavery through scientific breeding programs. He kept meticulous records of his enslaved people: height, weight, physical characteristics, work output, parentage. He arranged marriages between slaves he considered genetically superior, preventing others from reproducing. He purchased enslaved people specifically for their physical traits, trying to breed workers who were stronger, more compliant, more resistant to disease. The enslaved people of Blackwood Manor whispered that the master treated his human property exactly like his prized horses, breeding stock to be managed for maximum return. But Cornelius's obsessions went darker than simple eugenics. He was fascinated by the boundaries of species, by questions of hybridization, by experiments that any ethical person would have recognized as monstrous. In his private journals that would later be found and destroyed by his family to protect their name, he wrote extensively about attempts to crossbreed different animal species, about his theories of improving human slaves through unknown methods, about his belief that the boundaries between human and animal were not as fixed as religious doctrine claimed. Cornelius was also a man of profound cruelty who disguised his sadism as scientific inquiry. He performed surgical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia, claiming he was studying pain tolerance. He tested the limits of human endurance through starvation, exposure to elements, and systematic torture, all carefully documented in his journals. He justified every atrocity as advancing human knowledge, never acknowledging that his victims were human beings with the same capacity for suffering as himself. His wife, Margaret Blackwood, was 48 years old, the daughter of a South Carolina rice planter. She was a thin, severe woman with graying blonde hair, always pulled back in a tight bun, pale skin kept pale through constant use of parasols and powders, and eyes that could freeze water in July. Margaret ran the big house with tyrannical efficiency, managing the house slaves with a combination of psychological manipulation and sudden violence. She was known to slap enslaved women across the face for imagined infractions, to pinch children until they bruised, to withhold food as punishment for minor mistakes. Margaret was deeply jealous of any enslaved woman who showed beauty or youth, convinced that her husband's frequent visits to the slave quarters were romantic rather than purely sadistic. She took particular pleasure in humiliating attractive female slaves, cutting their hair, dressing them in deliberately ugly clothing, assigning them the most degrading tasks. She justified her cruelty through the same religious framework preached at Grace Episcopal Church. These were cursed people, descendants of Ham, animals in human form who required firm discipline. The Blackwoods had 3 children. Their eldest son, Nathaniel, was 26 years old in 1857, a younger version of his father with the same cold eyes and the same fascination with cruelty disguised as science. He'd been educated at the University of Virginia, where he studied agriculture and developed his father's same interests in breeding experiments. Nathaniel was being groomed to inherit Blackwood Manor, learning his father's methods, participating in his father's experiments, developing his own theories about racial improvement through controlled breeding. The overseer, Marcus Thornton, was a different kind of monster. He was 39 years old, a poor white man from Tennessee who'd worked his way up from driver to overseer through demonstrated willingness to inflict any level of violence necessary to maintain control. Marcus was 6 feet 2 inches tall, heavily muscled, with a scarred face from a knife fight in his youth and hands like hammers. He carried a whip at all times, a 9-foot black snake whip made of braided leather that could strip flesh from bone, and he used it frequently and enthusiastically. Marcus believed in rule through terror. He started every week by selecting someone for a public whipping, regardless of whether they'd committed any infraction, just to remind everyone what disobedience meant. He raped enslaved women as a demonstration of power, forcing their husbands and fathers to watch, daring them to react so he'd have an excuse for further violence. He created elaborate punishments for small offences, forcing people to stand on one leg in the hot sun for 8 hours, rubbing salt into whip wounds, locking people in the sweat box, a metal container that turned into an oven in the Mississippi heat. But Marcus also had a weakness that the enslaved community knew well. He was terrified of anything he considered supernatural. He believed in ghosts, in haints, in conjure magic. The enslaved people of Blackwood Manor used this fear, leaving small signs of hoodoo around his cabin, crossroads dirt on his doorstep, graveyard dirt in his path, chicken feet hung from trees. It didn't stop his violence, but it unnerved him, made him look over his shoulder at night, made him drink more than he should. The 3 black drivers, Isaac, Samuel, and Job, occupied the most tragic positions in the plantation hierarchy. They were enslaved men who'd been elevated to positions of power over other enslaved people, given slightly better food, slightly better cabins, and the authority to enforce work quotas and discipline. In exchange, they were required to betray their own community, to whip their brothers when quotas weren't met, to report any whispers of resistance, to choose between their own survival and their people's collective welfare. Isaac was 42, a large man with greying hair who'd been born on Blackwood Manor and promoted to driver 15 years earlier. He hated himself for what he'd become, but believed he had no choice. He had a wife and 4 children whose survival depended on his cooperation. He tried to minimize harm where he could, warning people before infractions were noticed, administering lighter punishments when he could get away with it, but he was still complicit in the system that destroyed lives daily. Samuel was 35, a harder man than Isaac, who'd embraced his role and the small power it gave him. He was cruel in ways that even Marcus Thornton noticed and approved. Samuel believed that by proving his loyalty to the master, he might earn eventual freedom, a delusion that blinded him to the reality that he was as much property as anyone else. Job was the youngest at 28, the newest driver, still learning how to navigate his impossible position. He was haunted by what he was forced to do, but terrified of being demoted back to fieldwork, of losing the small privileges that made life marginally more bearable. Life at Blackwood Manor followed a brutal routine. Field hands woke at 4:30 in the morning when the overseer's horn blew. They had 30 minutes to use the outdoor privies, splash water on their faces, and choke down a breakfast of cornmeal mush. By 5 o'clock, they were in the fields, working until noon, with a 30-minute break for a meal of beans and cornbread. Then back to the fields until dark, often 8 or 9 o'clock in summer. After work came the long walk back to the quarters, perhaps an hour to eat, mend clothes, tend small garden plots, and collapse onto corn-shuck mattresses before doing it all again. Sundays were supposedly rest days, but the enslaved people of Blackwood Manor used that time for essential survival work, tending their small garden plots that supplemented their meager rations, washing clothes, repairing cabins, trying to maintain some small dignity in lives designed to strip them of all humanity. Some attended services in the plantation chapel, where a white preacher told them to obey their masters as they would obey God. Others held secret services in the woods, hush harbors, where they could worship freely, sing spirituals that carried coded messages, practice African religious traditions mixed with Christianity. But amidst the grinding horror of daily life, there were moments of fierce humanity that survived. There was love between people who chose each other despite the system that claimed the right to separate them at any moment. There were parents who sang to their children, who taught them to read despite the laws forbidding it, who told them stories of Africa, of resistance, of a world beyond slavery. There were friendships between women who supported each other through unspeakable trauma, between men who shared what little they had. There was music, spirituals that spoke of freedom in coded language, work songs that helped people endure, songs passed down from African ancestors that kept culture alive. There was also resistance, constant and varied. There was the field hand who deliberately broke tools, the cook who made the master's food just slightly off, enough to cause discomfort, but not enough to be punished. The house slave who accidentally broke expensive china, the driver who warned people before the overseer noticed infractions, the woman who used contraceptive herbs to prevent bringing children into slavery, the elderly man who told stories of Nat Turner, of Gabriel Prosser, of Denmark Vesey, keeping alive the memory that resistance was possible. And there were the conjure women and root workers, the people who kept African spiritual traditions alive, who knew the healing properties of plants and the deadly properties too. They prepared love potions and healing salves, but they also knew which plants caused agonizing death, which could make someone violently ill, which could induce madness. They were feared by overseers and masters alike, because everyone knew that the person who cooked your food or tended your garden had the knowledge and perhaps the will to poison you. When Dinah arrived at Blackwood Manor in March of 1855, she was assigned to work with the plantation's livestock, horses, cattle, pigs, chickens. It was a role that suited her skills, and for the first several months she dared to hope that life here might be bearable. She was given a small cabin near the livestock barns, away from the main slave quarters. She received better food than field hands. The master wanted his animal tender, well-fed and strong. She worked long hours, but not under the brutal sun of the cotton fields. She formed cautious friendships with other enslaved people, particularly with an elderly woman named Seraphina, who worked as the plantation's midwife and herb woman. Seraphina was 73 years old, born in Africa, captured as a young woman, and surviving 6 decades of slavery through sheer will and accumulated knowledge. Seraphina recognized something in Dinah: intelligence, observation skills, capacity to learn. The old woman began teaching Dinah her knowledge of plants, of healing herbs and deadly ones, of spiritual practices that connected them to ancestors and to power that masters couldn't control. Dinah also formed a relationship with a man named Solomon, a 36-year-old blacksmith who worked in the plantation's forge. Solomon was tall and strong, with gentle eyes and skilled hands that could shape iron into tools, shoes for horses and chains for people, work that broke his heart but kept him alive. They spoke in the evenings when work was done, shared meals, found comfort in each other's presence. They even talked quietly of escape, of somehow making it to the Underground Railroad, of freedom in the north. For 8 months, Dinah's life at Blackwood Manor followed this pattern. Hard work, small kindnesses, moments of connection, the daily indignities of slavery, but nothing worse than she'd endured before. Until November of 1855, when Master Cornelius Blackwood summoned her to the big house and told her about his experiment. If you're reading this and feeling your stomach turn, you should. What follows is not fiction. These experiments happened. The historical record documents them, though most textbooks conveniently omit the details. This is the America that was built on bodies treated as laboratory equipment, where human beings were subjected to torture disguised as science, where monsters wore suits and attended church and convinced themselves they were progressive thinkers rather than sadists. Cornelius Blackwood stood in his library, surrounded by books on animal husbandry and racial pseudoscience, and explained to Dinah that she'd been selected for a special project. He'd read accounts, he said, of ancient attempts to crossbreed humans with animals. He'd studied the anatomy of both, the similarities in reproductive systems. He believed it was theoretically possible, and he intended to test the theory. Dinah would be the subject of his experiment in forced breeding with a horse. Dinah stood frozen as he spoke, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. No human being, however monstrous, could actually intend to do this, but Cornelius continued speaking in the same calm, scientific tone he might use to discuss crop rotation. He'd selected his finest stallion, a thoroughbred named Perseus. He'd studied the optimal timing based on Dinah's monthly cycle. He'd prepared a special breeding structure in one of the barns. He expected her cooperation, and if she resisted, her friend Solomon would be gelded and sold to the worst chain gang in Louisiana. The first attempt happened on November 14th, 1855. Dinah was dragged to the barn by Marcus Thornton and 2 drivers. Inside, Cornelius Blackwood, his son Nathaniel, and a visiting planter from Alabama named Edward Morrison waited with notebooks and measuring instruments. The stallion Perseus stood in a specially constructed pen, already agitated. What happened in that barn is almost impossible to write, but it must be written because it happened. Dinah was stripped naked and secured in a restraint system Cornelius had designed, positioned in a way he believed would facilitate his monstrous experiment. The stallion was brought close, encouraged by handlers, and when the animal reacted with natural confusion and aggression to the insane situation, when Dinah screamed and fought and begged, Cornelius and his witnesses took notes, measured responses, documented every horrific detail. The attempt failed, of course. Biology doesn't work the way Cornelius's diseased mind imagined, but the failure didn't stop him. It made him adjust his approach. Over the next 2 years, he subjected Dinah to this nightmare 17 times. Each attempt left her more physically damaged, more psychologically shattered. She suffered broken ribs when the stallion kicked her in panic. She suffered internal injuries that left her bleeding for days. She suffered wounds that became infected, that required Serafina's herbs to prevent death from sepsis. And after each failed attempt, Cornelius beat her. He blamed her for the failure, claimed she was deliberately sabotaging his experiment through some act of will. He whipped her back until it was a mass of scars. He denied her food for days as punishment. He forced her to sleep in the barn with the animals he'd tried to force her to mate with, as though proximity might somehow achieve what his insane breeding structures couldn't. Between attempts, Dinah lived in a nightmare state. She couldn't speak of what was happening. Cornelius had threatened to kill Solomon if she told anyone, and the enslaved community knew better than to ask questions about horrors they couldn't prevent. She continued her work with the livestock, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind fractured. She stopped eating until Serafina forced food down her throat. She stopped speaking except when necessary. She stopped sleeping, haunted by what had been done to her and what would be done again. Solomon knew something terrible was happening, though Dinah couldn't bring herself to tell him the full truth. He saw her injuries, the way she flinched from touch, the deadness in her eyes. He begged her to tell him, promised to protect her, but she remained silent to protect him. The distance between them grew, and that loss added to her suffering. The other enslaved people of Blackwood Manor knew in the way that close communities always know when something evil is happening. They saw Dinah's injuries. They noticed when she was taken to the barn and emerged hours later barely able to walk. They heard her screams, but they were powerless to stop it, trapped in a system where any resistance could mean death. All they could offer was small kindnesses, extra food left outside her cabin, herb poultices for her wounds, silent presence that said you're not alone. Serafina did more than offer comfort. The old woman recognized that Dinah was approaching a breaking point, that her mind was fracturing under trauma no human should endure. Serafina began teaching Dinah more than healing herbs. She taught her about the deadly plants of Mississippi, oleander, water hemlock, jimson weed, pokeweed, foxglove. She taught her about dosages, about symptoms, about deaths that could look like natural causes. She never said explicitly that Dinah should use this knowledge for revenge, but the gift was clear. If Dinah chose to fight back, she would have the tools. Through 1856, the experiments continued. Cornelius grew more obsessed and more frustrated with each failure. He consulted with other planters who shared his scientific interests, describing his experiments in letters that treated Dinah as nothing more than test equipment. Some recipients expressed fascination. Others politely discouraged him. None reported him to authorities, because there were no authorities who cared what a master did to his property. Nathaniel Blackwood became increasingly involved in his father's experiments, developing his own theories, suggesting modifications to the breeding structures, taking his own notes. The young man showed the same cold detachment as his father, the same ability to witness suffering without seeing the suffering person. Margaret Blackwood knew what was happening in the barn. She'd seen Dinah's injuries, heard the screams, read portions of her husband's journals. Her response was not sympathy, but intensified cruelty toward Dinah. She blamed Dinah for tempting her husband into sin, for causing his obsession, for existing as an attractive young woman who drew his attention. When Dinah had to work in the big house, Margaret found excuses to pinch her, slap her, burn her with hot irons, pour boiling water on her feet. Small cruelties added to enormous ones. By February of 1857, Dinah had endured 17 of Cornelius's experiments. She was 31 years old, her body covered in scars, her mind surviving through a combination of dissociation and the small hope that Seraphina's teachings represented. She had not broken, but she had transformed. The gentle woman who'd arrived at Blackwood Manor 23 months earlier no longer existed. In her place was something harder, colder, more dangerous. On February 7th, 1857, Cornelius performed his 17th attempt. This one was particularly brutal because he'd invited 3 other planters to witness and document the experiment. 4 white men stood in that barn with their notebooks and measuring tools, while Dinah screamed herself hoarse. And when the attempt failed again, when Perseus the Stallion kicked free of his handlers and nearly trampled everyone in panic, Cornelius lost his temper completely. He ordered Marcus Thornton to whip Dinah right there in the barn in front of his guests. 50 lashes for failing to cooperate with scientific progress. Marcus tied her to a post and counted out each stroke while the flesh of her back split and bled. The visiting planters watched with varying expressions, some uncomfortable, others fascinated, all complicit. When the whipping ended and Dinah hung unconscious from her restraints, Cornelius made an announcement that would seal his fate. He told his guests that the experiments had clearly failed, that Dinah had proven unsuitable for his purposes. Therefore, he would try a different approach. He would breed Dinah with Solomon the blacksmith to produce children who could be raised from birth as experimental subjects. Then he would sell Dinah to a brothel in Natchez that specialized in enslaved women, where she could at least be profitable. Those words, spoken while Dinah drifted in and out of consciousness, planted the seed that would bloom into the massacre of July 23rd. When Dinah woke 2 days later in her cabin, tended by Seraphina, she was changed in a fundamental way. The hope that had kept her alive, that eventually this nightmare would end, that she might escape, that life might somehow become bearable, was gone. She had nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in the world. Seraphina sat beside Dinah's bed and spoke quietly about plants, about dosages, about timing. The old woman asked no questions about what Dinah intended to do. She simply provided knowledge and then said, "When you're ready, tell me what you need. I'll help you get it." Dinah lay in that bed for 3 more days, healing physically while her mind worked. She thought about every person who'd participated in her torture. Master Cornelius, who'd conceived and directed the experiments. Nathaniel, who'd participated eagerly. Marcus Thornton, who'd whipped her 50 times on command. The 3 drivers who'd held her down. Margaret Blackwood, who'd added petty cruelties to massive ones. The visiting planters who'd witnessed her suffering as entertainment. She thought about methods. Poison was the obvious choice. She had access to deadly plants, knowledge of how to prepare them. opportunities to administer them through food or drink. But poison alone felt insufficient. These people had tortured her for 2 years, treated her like an animal, broken her body repeatedly. They deserved worse than a quiet death from oleander tea. She thought about fire. Blackwood Manor was constructed of wood, painted white but dried by decades of Mississippi sun. It would burn beautifully, especially if someone blocked the exits first. Cornelius and his family could burn alive in the house they'd built with stolen labor. She thought about the tools she used daily: pitchforks, hoes, sickles, scythes. Each could be a weapon. Each could deliver justice measured in blood. And then she thought about timing. If she acted immediately, she might kill 1 or 2 people before being caught. But if she planned carefully, if she waited for the right moment, she could kill them all. Everyone who'd participated in her torture, everyone who'd stood by and watched, everyone who'd benefited from the system that made her suffering possible. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, while white families in Woodville exchanged cards and sweets, Dinah made her decision. She would kill them all. And she would do it in a way that made them understand exactly why they were dying. The planning began that night. Dinah understood that successful revenge required intelligence more than strength. She was one woman against the power structure of an entire plantation, an entire county, an entire system designed to crush resistance. She would have to be smarter, more patient, more ruthless than her enemies. Her first decision was about timing. She needed an event that would bring all her targets together in one location at a predictable time. Blackwood Manor hosted a large gathering every July 23rd, the anniversary of Cornelius Blackwood's purchase of the plantation 32 years earlier. The event attracted neighboring planters, local officials, family members. It was a celebration of wealth and power, a demonstration of Southern aristocracy, a perfect target. That gave Dinah 5 months and 9 days to prepare. 5 months to gather resources, study routines, perfect her plan, and maintain the mask of broken obedience that made masters feel safe. Her second decision was about method. She would use multiple approaches: poison for some, direct violence for others, fire for the finale. The deaths would be tailored to the crimes. Cornelius, who treated her like breeding stock, would die like an animal. Nathaniel, who'd taken notes on her suffering, would learn what suffering felt like. Marcus Thornton, who'd wielded the whip, would feel its kiss one last time. Margaret Blackwood, who'd burned her with irons, would burn. Her third decision was about accomplices. Could she trust anyone else with this knowledge? Would anyone help her? Or was this something she had to do alone? She decided to speak with Seraphina first. The old woman had already offered help, had taught her about poisons, had seen her suffering. If anyone would understand, it would be Seraphina. On the night of February 15th, Dinah went to Seraphina's cabin in the darkness between midnight and dawn. She knocked softly, entered when invited, and sat across from the old woman in the flickering light of a single candle. "I'm going to kill them," Dinah said simply. Seraphina nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Tell me." Dinah laid out her plan. The July 23rd gathering, multiple deaths executed simultaneously, poison in the food and drink, violence for those who tried to escape, fire to destroy the evidence and the symbol of their power, an act of vengeance so complete that it would terrorize every plantation owner in Mississippi. When Dinah finished speaking, Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You understand what this means. They will hunt you. They will torture you before they kill you. The other enslaved people here might be punished for your actions. This will bring hell down on all of us." "I know," Dinah said, "but I'm already in hell, and I'm done suffering alone." Seraphina reached out and took Dinah's hands. "Then I will help you. I'm 73 years old. I've lived my whole life in chains. I've delivered babies who I knew would grow up in slavery. I've buried friends killed by masters. I've survived by keeping my head down and my knowledge hidden. But before I die, I want to see one master pay for what they've done. I want to see fear in their eyes. I'll help you, child. Tell me what you need." Over the next week, Serafina and Dinah created a detailed plan. Serafina had knowledge of every poisonous plant in Mississippi, where they grew, when to harvest them, how to prepare them for maximum effect. She taught Dinah the difference between poisons that killed quickly and those that caused prolonged suffering, between those that looked like natural illness and those that were obviously murder. Oleander grew wild around the plantation. Every part of the plant was toxic: leaves, flowers, stems, roots, seeds. A tea made from oleander leaves caused vomiting, diarrhea, irregular heartbeat, seizures, and death within hours. The symptoms could be mistaken for cholera or food poisoning, especially if multiple people fell ill simultaneously. Water hemlock grew in the wet areas near the creek. It was one of the most violently poisonous plants in North America. Ingesting even a small amount caused violent convulsions, vomiting, and death within hours. There was no mistaking water hemlock poisoning for natural illness. It was obviously murder, which made it perfect for certain targets. Jimson weed grew in the disturbed soil around the barns. Its seeds and leaves contained powerful hallucinogens and toxins. A tea made from Jimson weed caused delirium, hallucinations, seizures, and potentially death. The delirium phase could last hours, during which victims would be completely disoriented and vulnerable. Pokeweed grew along fences and property boundaries. Its roots and berries were toxic, causing burning in the mouth and throat, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, and convulsions. Cooked properly, pokeweed greens were a common food in the South, which meant poisoned pokeweed could be served as a familiar dish without raising suspicion. Foxglove grew in Margaret Blackwood's ornamental garden. The plant contained digitalis, which affected the heart. Small doses were actually medicinal, used to treat heart conditions. Larger doses caused nausea, vomiting, irregular heartbeat, hallucinations, and death. Foxglove poisoning could be slow and insidious, symptoms appearing hours or even days after ingestion. Serafina taught Dinah how to harvest these plants without being noticed, taking a few leaves here, a few roots there, never enough for anyone to notice the plants were being harvested. She taught her how to dry the plant material in hidden locations, how to grind it to powder, how to store it safely. She taught her dosages calculated by body weight, timing of symptoms, combinations that enhanced effects. But Serafina also taught Dinah about limitations. Poison worked best when administered to unsuspecting victims who ingested sufficient quantities. It required access to food and drink preparation, time for the poison to work, and acceptance that some intended victims might not eat enough to die. Poison was a tool, not a guarantee. That's why Dinah's plan included more direct methods. She began studying the plantation's tools and weapons. As the livestock tender, she had legitimate access to sharp implements: hoes for weeding, pitchforks for moving hay, scythes for cutting fodder, knives for veterinary work. She began evaluating each tool as a weapon, testing their weight and balance when no one was watching, practicing motions that could become killing strikes. The hoe became her weapon of choice for close combat. It was heavy enough to deliver devastating blows, sharp enough to cut, and familiar enough that carrying it wouldn't raise suspicion. She took a file to its edge when she was supposed to be maintaining tools, sharpening it far beyond what was necessary for agricultural work, until it could split a melon with a single stroke. She identified pitchforks with the sturdiest tines, scythes with the sharpest blades, knives with the best grips. She created hiding places for these weapons near the big house, buried in hay bales, tucked behind loose boards in the barn, positioned where she could grab them quickly when needed. She studied the layout of Blackwood Manor's big house in detail. As livestock tender, she occasionally had to come to the house to treat sick dogs or report on horse health. Each visit, she memorized more details. She counted doors and windows, noting which ones could be locked from outside. She observed the layout of rooms, identifying the main parlor where gatherings were held. She studied the servants' staircase that allowed movement through the house unseen. She noted that the kitchen was in a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, which meant fire in the kitchen wouldn't immediately spread to the main house unless deliberately encouraged. She paid attention to routines. Master Cornelius woke at 7 each morning and took breakfast at 8. Nathaniel slept later, rarely appearing before 9. Margaret breakfasted in bed, served by house slaves at 7:30. Marcus Thornton made rounds of the fields, starting at 5 in the morning, returned for lunch at noon, and usually got drunk in his cabin by 8 in the evening. The drivers worked from dawn to dusk, their routines dictated by seasonal agricultural demands. She observed the slaves who worked in the big house, who was loyal to the Blackwoods out of fear or genuine Stockholm syndrome, who might be sympathetic to resistance, who would need to be neutralized to prevent them from raising alarm. She identified Delilah, the head cook, as someone who'd suffered enough at Margaret's hands to possibly be recruited. She identified Peter, the butler, as someone too broken by decades of conditioning to trust with anything. She studied the guards and security measures. Blackwood Manor employed 2 white men as night watchmen who patrolled the grounds between sunset and sunrise, mainly to prevent theft and escape attempts. They were armed with shotguns and accompanied by dogs. Their patrol route was predictable. They circled the big house, then the slave quarters, then the barns, completing the circuit every 90 minutes. That meant a 90-minute window when certain areas were unobserved. She learned the location of guns in the big house. Cornelius kept a rifle above the mantel in his study and a pistol in his bedside drawer. Nathaniel kept a pistol in his room. Marcus Thornton kept a shotgun in his cabin. The night watchmen had their weapons, but were often careless about where they set them down during their shifts. As February turned to March, Dinah began collecting her poison materials. She harvested oleander leaves during her legitimate work, tending the ornamental plants around the big house, drying them in a hidden corner of the livestock barn. She gathered water hemlock roots from the creek during her rare moments of free time, claiming she was checking on escaped pigs when anyone questioned her. She collected jimsonweed seeds from around the barns, foxglove from Margaret's garden, pokeweed from the fence lines. She created hiding places for these materials. In the hayloft of the barn, she hollowed out a space inside a bale and stored dried plant material there. In a hollow tree near the creek, she hid ground poison powders in sealed jars. Under the floorboards of her own cabin, she kept her working supply. She began testing her poisons on rats that infested the barn. She mixed ground oleander leaves into cornmeal, placed it where rats would find it, and observed. The first rat to eat the poisoned meal began showing symptoms within 20 minutes. Agitation, drooling, then violent convulsions. Death came within 2 hours. She noted the dosage, calculated how much would be needed for a human of Master Cornelius's weight. She tested water hemlock on a larger rat, watching it go into violent convulsions within 15 minutes of ingestion, dead within 30. Too fast and too obvious for her purposes with Cornelius, but perfect for someone she wanted to suffer visibly. She tested jimsonweed on a pig that had been scheduled for slaughter anyway. The animal became wildly disoriented within an hour, hallucinating and thrashing. It took 6 hours to die. The prolonged delirium phase interested Dinah. A person in that state would be completely helpless, aware but unable to defend themselves. She tested combinations, discovering that mixing oleander with pokeweed intensified symptoms and shortened time to death. She discovered that foxglove could be administered in small doses over days, weakening a victim's heart so that a final larger dose would seem like natural heart failure. By April, Dinah had amassed enough poison to kill 20 people if properly administered. She had refined her understanding of dosages, timing, and symptoms. She was ready on that front. But poison alone wouldn't satisfy her need for justice. Cornelius Blackwood and his accomplices deserved to know why they were dying. They deserved to feel fear and pain. They deserved to understand that the woman they'd tortured for 2 years was the instrument of their destruction. That meant she needed opportunities for direct confrontation, for close violence, for looking them in the eyes as they died. She began practicing with her sharpened hoe late at night in the barn. She set up a grain sack stuffed with straw, approximately human-sized, and practiced striking it. She learned to aim for the neck, where a single blow with sufficient force could sever the head. She practiced the stance, the weight transfer, the follow-through. After dozens of practice sessions, she could decapitate the grain sack with one stroke. She practiced with the pitchfork, learning how to thrust it through the straw dummy with enough force to penetrate completely. She aimed for the torso, where vital organs clustered. She practiced withdrawing the weapon quickly for multiple strikes. She practiced with knives, learning how to slash and stab with maximum damage. She studied the anatomy of pigs and cows she treated, learning where arteries ran close to the surface, where vital organs sat, where a blade could cause the most bleeding or the quickest death. This training happened in stolen moments, late at night when she should have been sleeping, early in the morning before anyone else woke, during lunch breaks when others ate, and she claimed she needed to check on sick animals. She pushed her body to maintain strength, despite the poor diet and hard labor, knowing she would need every bit of endurance on the night of July 23rd. By May, Dinah had developed detailed kill plans for each of her primary targets. Master Cornelius Blackwood would die slowly and in agony. She would administer foxglove in small doses through his food over the 2 weeks leading up to July 23rd, weakening his heart. On the night of the gathering, she would serve him wine heavily laced with water hemlock. As he began convulsing, she would appear before him and tell him exactly why he was dying. And if he somehow survived the poison, she would finish him with her sharpened hoe, removing his head the way his experiments had tried to remove her humanity. Nathaniel Blackwood would die in the barn where he'd taken notes on her suffering. She would lure him there with a message about a sick horse, then attack him with the pitchfork. She would not give him a quick death. She wanted him to feel every puncture, to beg for mercy as she'd begged, to die slowly in the same place he'd documented her torture. Marcus Thornton would die by whipping. She planned to somehow restrain him, Jimson Weed, to disorient him first. Perhaps then tie him to the same whipping post where he'd administered countless beatings. She would deliver 200 lashes, far more than any person could survive, while telling him the name of every person he'd ever whipped. His death would be poetic justice. Margaret Blackwood would die by fire. Dinah planned to lock her in a room and set it ablaze, letting her feel the burning she'd inflicted on others. Or if opportunity allowed, Dinah would heat the flat irons Margaret used to press clothes and press them against Margaret's flesh repeatedly, marking her the way she'd marked Dinah. The 3 drivers, Isaac, Samuel and Job, presented a moral complexity. They were fellow slaves, coerced into their roles. Yet they'd held Dinah down during some of the experiments. She wrestled with whether they deserved death or mercy. She decided their fates would depend on their actions on July 23rd. If they helped the masters, they would die with them. If they stood aside or helped her, they would be spared. The 2 night watchmen would need to be eliminated to prevent them from raising alarm. Dinah planned to poison their evening meal with oleander, timing it so they would become incapacitated during their shift, unable to interfere or call for help. The visiting planters who'd witnessed her suffering on February 7th, Edward Morrison from Alabama, Richard Patterson from Louisiana, and Thomas Whitfield from South Carolina, the same reverend who preached divine justification for slavery, were all expected to attend the July 23rd gathering. If they attended, they would die. Dinah didn't care that killing a prominent reverend would bring extra attention. She wanted them all to pay, but Dinah also knew she couldn't execute this plan alone. She needed inside help, particularly from someone with access to the big house kitchen on July 23rd. In late May, she approached Delilah, the head cook. Delilah was 46 years old, a solid woman with graying hair and arms strong from decades of lifting cast-iron pots. She'd worked in the Blackwood kitchen for 28 years, ever since she was 18. She'd suffered Margaret's petty cruelties daily: slaps across the face for food that was too hot or too cold, burns from pots accidentally knocked onto her arms, constant criticism and humiliation. Delilah had also lost 2 children to the Blackwoods. Her son, Thomas, had been sold away at age 10 because Nathaniel wanted a new horse and the plantation needed cash. Her daughter Ruth had died at 14 from an infected wound after Margaret whipped her for breaking a teacup. Delilah had reasons to hate the Blackwoods that rivaled Dinah's. Dinah waited until she saw Delilah alone in the kitchen garden, picking herbs for the evening meal. She approached casually, helping gather thyme and rosemary as though she just happened to be passing by. "Delilah," Dinah said quietly, "can I trust you?" The older woman's hands stilled. She looked at Dinah with sharp, evaluating eyes. "That depends on what you're trusting me with, child." "The July 23rd gathering," Dinah said. "I need access to the food preparation. I need to add ingredients to certain dishes, ingredients that will make the masters very sick." Delilah understood immediately. She set down her basket and looked at Dinah fully. "Sick enough to die?" "Yes." A long silence. Then Delilah asked, "Just the masters or everyone?" "Just the masters, just people who've earned it. Not innocent guests, not us. I need your help to make sure only the right people eat the right food." Delilah thought for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she said, "Margaret Blackwood killed my daughter, worked her to exhaustion, then whipped her for being clumsy when she was half dead with fever. Ruth died in my arms, and I couldn't do anything except watch. I've fantasized for 6 years about poisoning that woman's food, but I never had the courage." "I have the courage," Dinah said, "and I have the poison. I just need access." Delilah nodded slowly. "On July 23rd, I'll be preparing the feast. You tell me which dishes go to which people, and I'll make sure they're served exactly right. I'll add whatever you give me to the right dishes, and if anyone asks why you're in the kitchen, I'll say I needed help with heavy pots." "They'll kill us when they figure it out," Dinah warned. "I'm 46 years old," Delilah said. "I've lived almost 3 decades in this kitchen, cooking food for people who treat me like a cooking pot with a voice. If I can poison Margaret Blackwood's food before I die, I'll consider my life well spent. I'm in." With Delilah recruited, Dinah refined her plan. The July 23rd gathering would feature an elaborate feast, multiple courses, fine wines, southern delicacies designed to demonstrate Blackwood wealth. Delilah would prepare separate dishes for different guests, and Dinah would provide specific poisons for specific targets. For the general guest population, neighboring planters who hadn't directly participated in Dinah's torture, but who upheld the system of slavery, she would use a mild dose of pokeweed in a shared vegetable dish. Enough to cause severe gastrointestinal distress and hours of vomiting, but unlikely to kill healthy adults. They would suffer, but survive. For the 3 planters who'd witnessed her February torture, Morrison, Patterson and Whitfield, she would use stronger oleander in the wine they would be served. They would begin showing symptoms an hour after dinner, becoming violently ill, likely dying within hours. Their deaths would be clearly poisoning rather than natural illness, which would cause immediate panic. For Master Cornelius, she would use water hemlock in his personal wine glass. The symptoms would be unmistakable and horrific. Violent convulsions, foam at the mouth, death within 30 minutes to an hour. Everyone would see him dying, and in his final moments of consciousness, Dinah would make sure he saw her and understood. For Nathaniel, Margaret and Marcus Thornton, Dinah didn't plan to use poison at all. She wanted to kill them personally, with her own hands and her chosen weapons. The poison would create chaos and distraction that would allow her to move through the house and grounds, hunting them individually. Through June, Dinah continued her preparations while maintaining her mask of broken compliance. She treated animals, she followed orders, she kept her head down. When Master Cornelius summoned her for one final experiment on June 12th, he'd obtained a different stallion and wanted to try one more time. She endured it as she'd endured the previous attempts, storing her rage for later. When Marcus Thornton whipped her for moving too slowly on June 18th, she took the 20 lashes without crying out, healing the wounds with Seraphina's salves, adding Marcus's name to her mental list with renewed hatred. When Margaret Blackwood burned her hand with a hot iron on June 25th for improperly brushing a horse, Dinah apologized meekly and imagined how Margaret would scream when fire consumed her. She moved poison supplies closer to the big house, hiding jars of ground oleander and water hemlock in the kitchen garden where Delilah could access them. She positioned weapons in strategic locations, the sharpened hoe in the barn where she planned to kill Nathaniel, a razor-sharp scythe hidden in the garden near the big house, knives concealed in various outbuildings. She recruited one additional accomplice, Solomon. She'd avoided involving Solomon for months, trying to protect him, but she realized she needed his help. On July 1st, she finally told him everything about the experiments Cornelius had performed, about her plan for revenge, about the massacre that would occur in 22 days. She expected him to try to talk her out of it, to argue for escape instead of violence. Instead, Solomon listened to her confession with growing horror and rage. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her while she finally broke down and cried for the first time since February. Then he said, "Tell me how I can help. Tell me who you want me to kill." Together, they refined the plan further. Solomon would handle the night watchman, using his blacksmith skills to create a tool that looked like he was doing legitimate repair work while actually giving him access to weapons. He would position himself to prevent anyone from escaping the big house when the chaos began. They discussed escape routes. After the killing was done, they would run. Solomon had been secretly making contact with Underground Railroad conductors for months, preparing for possible escape. He knew of a station 15 miles north, hidden in a barn owned by a Quaker family who opposed slavery. If they could make it there before the alarm spread, they had a chance. But both of them acknowledged the likelihood that they wouldn't survive to escape. The plan they'd created was designed for maximum destruction, not clean getaway. They were choosing justice over survival, vengeance over freedom. "I'd rather die free after killing these monsters than live one more year as a slave," Dinah said. "Then we die free together," Solomon agreed. The final 2 weeks before July 23rd were the longest of Dinah's life. She existed in a state of heightened awareness, seeing everything in sharp detail, memorizing faces and voices, preparing herself mentally for violence. She had one final conversation with Seraphina on July 20th. The old woman knew everything by then, and she blessed Dinah's mission in a ceremony that mixed Christian prayer with African spirituality. Seraphina anointed Dinah's hands with oil made from protective herbs, speaking in Yoruba, words passed down from her grandmother. She called on the ancestors to guide Dinah's hands, to give her strength, to accept the spirits of her enemies when Dinah sent them to judgment. "You are the instrument of justice," Seraphina said. "You are the answer to prayers that have been whispered in these quarters for generations. You are the nightmare that masters have feared since they first put chains on our ancestors. Walk in power, child, and when you strike, strike without mercy, because they showed you none." On July the 22nd, The guests began arriving at Blackwood Manor. Edward Morrison from Alabama came with his wife and 2 adult sons. Richard Patterson from Louisiana arrived with his daughter and son-in-law. Reverend Thomas Whitfield from South Carolina came alone, pious and pompous. Other neighboring planters arrived through the afternoon, the Rutherfords from the next county, the Caldwells from Natchez, the Beaumonts from Vicksburg. By evening of July 22nd, the big house was filled with the sound of laughter, conversation, and celebration. Enslaved people served drinks and food, played music, attended to every need of the white guests who discussed politics, cotton prices, and the growing tensions between North and South. Dinah observed from a distance, noting who had arrived, where they were staying, their routines. She confirmed that all 3 of her primary witness targets, Morrison, Patterson, and Whitfield, were present. She watched Nathaniel showing his father's scientific journals to interested guests, describing the breeding experiments with the detached tone of an agricultural report. She saw Margaret holding court among the plantation wives, discussing household management and the proper discipline of house slaves. She saw Master Cornelius receiving congratulations on 32 successful years of plantation ownership. She went to bed that night in her cabin, but sleep was impossible. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the monster of Mississippi would learn what it meant to create a monster of your own. Tomorrow, justice would be served in blood and fire. Tomorrow, Dinah would either die free or live free, but she would never again be a victim. July 23rd, 1857, dawned clear and hot. The Mississippi sun rose into a sky without clouds, promising temperatures in the high 90s. Perfect weather for a celebration, the white folks said. Perfect weather for vengeance, Dinah thought. The day began normally. Enslaved people woke before dawn to prepare for the evening's feast. Delilah and her kitchen staff started cooking at 4 in the morning, preparing dishes that would be served throughout the day and culminating in an elaborate dinner at 7 in the evening. Dinah rose at her usual time, fed and watered the livestock, performed her normal duties, and waited. At 9 in the morning, she went to the kitchen garden to help Delilah gather fresh herbs. In reality, she delivered the poison packages, small cloth bags containing precisely measured amounts of ground plant material, labeled in a code only Delilah understood. One bag contained oleander for the wine that would be served to Morrison, Patterson, and Whitfield. Another contained water hemlock for Cornelius's personal wine glass. A third contained pokeweed for the general vegetable dish. Delilah took the bags without comment, hiding them in her apron. "It will be done," she said quietly. At noon, the guests gathered for a light lunch on the veranda. Dinah watched from the barn, noting positions. Cornelius held court at the head of the table, telling stories about the plantation's early days. Margaret supervised the service with her usual critical eye. Nathaniel sat beside his father, laughing at appropriate moments. Marcus Thornton stood nearby, ostensibly providing security, but mainly drinking the bourbon that flowed freely. At 2 in the afternoon, Dinah checked her weapon caches one final time. The sharpened hoe in the barn, positioned where she could grab it quickly. The pitchfork with reinforced tines, the scythe hidden in the garden, the knives in various locations. Everything was ready. At 4 in the afternoon, Solomon found her in the barn. They stood together in silence, holding hands, both aware this might be the last peaceful moment they ever experienced. "No regrets?" Solomon asked. "None," Dinah said. "Then let's send these devils to hell." At 5 in the afternoon, guests began preparing for the evening feast. Women changed into their finest dresses. Men put on fresh suits. Enslaved people lit lamps throughout the big house, set tables, arranged flowers, prepared the dining room for the celebration. At 6 in the evening, Dinah went to the kitchen under the pretense of delivering fresh eggs. She found Delilah working over multiple pots and dishes, her staff bustling around her. Delilah caught Dinah's eye and gave the smallest nod. The poisons had been added to the designated dishes. At 6:30, the two night watchmen ate their dinner in their cabin. The stew Delilah had sent them was delicious, they said. They didn't notice the slight bitterness of ground oleander leaves mixed into the rich broth. By 7:15, both men would be violently ill, in no condition to patrol or raise alarm. At 7 in the evening, the dinner bell rang. Guests filed into the dining room, taking seats at a table that groaned under the weight of southern delicacies. Roast pig with crackling skin, fried chicken golden and crispy, cornbread and biscuits still steaming, collard greens and okra, sweet potato pie and peach cobbler, and wine, lots of wine, in crystal glasses that caught the lamplight. Dinah watched from outside the dining room window, her heart pounding. She saw Delilah and her staff serving dishes with careful precision. The vegetable dish with pokeweed went to the center of the table for general consumption. The wine bottle with oleander went to Morrison, Patterson and Whitfield's end of the table, and a special crystal glass, filled with deep red wine laced with water hemlock, was placed at Master Cornelius's place setting. At 7:15, Master Cornelius raised his special glass and proposed a toast. "To 32 years of Blackwood Manor," he announced, "to prosperity, to progress, to the southern way of life. May it endure forever." "Hear, hear!" the guests responded, raising their own glasses. Cornelius drank deeply, draining half his glass in one swallow. The water hemlock went down his throat, beginning its work immediately. At 7:23, the first symptoms appeared. Cornelius set down his glass and frowned, touching his stomach. "I feel peculiar," he said. At 7:25, Morrison, Patterson and Whitfield began showing symptoms of oleander poisoning. Morrison complained of nausea. Patterson pushed away from the table, his face pale. Whitfield clutched his chest, feeling his heart begin to race irregularly. At 7:27, several guests who'd eaten the pokeweed vegetables began feeling sick. One woman excused herself to rush to the privy. A man loosened his collar, sweating. At 7:30, Cornelius Blackwood began to convulse. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. His body jerked violently, muscles contracting beyond his control. Foam began forming at his mouth, his eyes rolled back. He tried to speak, but only choking sounds emerged. The dining room erupted in chaos. Guests screamed. Some rushed to help Cornelius. Others began vomiting from the pokeweed. Morrison collapsed from his chair, writhing. Patterson crawled toward the door. Whitfield clutched his chest, his heart beating erratically from the oleander. Margaret Blackwood shrieked, rushing to her husband's side. Nathaniel shouted for someone to fetch a doctor. Marcus Thornton drew his pistol, looking for threats, not understanding that the threat had already been ingested. And Dinah walked through the front door of the big house, holding her sharpened hoe. She walked calmly through the chaos of the entrance hall, past enslaved people who stared at her in shock, toward the dining room where her torturers were dying and where others were about to die. She stepped into the doorway of the dining room. The scene before her was beautiful chaos. Cornelius thrashing on the floor, his body destroying itself from the inside. Morrison and Patterson dying slowly from oleander, Whitfield clutching his chest, other guests violently ill. The master's celebration had become a chamber of suffering, and then Cornelius's convulsing body went still for a moment. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, focused on the doorway, focused on Dinah standing there with her hoe. Their eyes met, and Dinah smiled. "Hello, master," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Do you recognize me? I'm the woman you tried to breed with horses. I'm the experiment that failed. I'm the animal you tortured for 2 years. Cornelius tried to speak, but his seized muscles wouldn't cooperate. Foam and blood bubbled from his mouth. "I wanted you to know," Dinah continued, "before you die. I wanted you to see my face and understand that I did this. Every drop of poison in your body I put there. This death you're dying, I chose it for you. You treated me like an animal, so I'm killing you like one." Cornelius's body convulsed again, more violently. His back arched, his hands clawed at his throat. "This is justice," Dinah said. "This is what you earned." And then she watched, calmly, as the most powerful man in Wilkinson County died, thrashing on the floor like a poisoned rat, choking on his own vomit, his fine suit soiled. His dignity gone, his last sight the face of the woman he'd broken, who had refused to stay broken. Master Cornelius Blackwood died at 7:33 in the evening on July 23rd, 1857. He was 55 years old. He died in agony in front of his guests in his own home, at the hands of the woman he'd considered his property, and the killing had only just begun. As Cornelius's body went still, the dining room erupted in fresh chaos. Margaret Blackwood screamed, cradling her dead husband's head. Nathaniel pulled a pistol from his jacket. Marcus Thornton aimed his own pistol at Dinah. Guests scrambled for exits, but Dinah had planned for this moment. As Nathaniel raised his pistol, Solomon appeared behind him. The blacksmith's hammer came down on Nathaniel's skull with devastating force. The young man crumpled, his pistol clattering to the floor. As Marcus Thornton tried to aim at Dinah, she was already moving. She crossed the dining room in 3 long strides and swung her hoe. The sharpened blade caught Marcus across the throat, opening his jugular. Blood sprayed across the white tablecloth. Marcus dropped his pistol, both hands going to his throat. Trying uselessly to stop the arterial bleeding, he staggered backward, knocking over chairs, and collapsed. The head overseer of Blackwood Manor died at 7:34 in the evening, choking on his own blood, his whip-calloused hands unable to save him. Margaret Blackwood looked up from her husband's corpse to see Dinah standing over Marcus Thornton's body. Their eyes met, and Margaret understood. "You," Margaret whispered, "you did this." "Yes," Dinah said. "Did you think I would endure forever? Did you think there would be no reckoning?" Margaret scrambled to her feet, hiking up her skirts, and ran. She fled the dining room, pushing past sick and dying guests, heading for the stairs to the second floor. Dinah followed at a walk, hoe in hand, blood dripping from the blade. The other guests panicked. Some ran for the front door, bursting outside into the evening air. Others ran toward the back of the house, looking for alternate exits. Morrison, Patterson, and Whitfield were too sick to run, vomiting and convulsing from the oleander poison. They would die slowly over the next 2 hours, their systems shutting down organ by organ. But Dinah's primary targets were still alive and fleeing, and she had work to do. Nathaniel Blackwood regained consciousness in the barn 20 minutes later. His head throbbed from where Solomon had struck him. His hands were bound with rope. He was tied, standing upright, arms stretched above his head, connected to a beam, and Dinah stood before him, holding a pitchfork. "Where am I?" Nathaniel asked groggily. Then his eyes focused and he saw her. "You, what have you done?" "Your father is dead," Dinah said calmly. "Poisoned, so is Marcus Thornton. Throat cut, and now it's your turn." And Nathaniel's face went from confusion to fear to rage. "You can't do this. I'm a white man. You're a slave. They'll hang you. They'll burn you alive." "I know," Dinah said, "but you'll already be dead." She drove the pitchfork into his stomach, just below his ribs. The tines punched through flesh and muscle, through his intestines, through his back. Nathaniel screamed. Dinah withdrew the pitchfork. Blood poured from the 4 puncture wounds. Nathaniel sagged against his bonds, gasping. "Do you remember this barn?" Dinah asked conversationally. "This is where your father conducted his experiments. This is where you stood with your notebook taking notes while I screamed. Do you remember what you wrote?" "Please!" Nathaniel gasped. "Please!" "You wrote," Dinah continued as if he hadn't spoken, "that I showed remarkable pain tolerance. You wrote that my screams indicated psychological distress more than physical damage. You wrote that further experiments should continue despite lack of results. She drove the pitchfork into him again, this time through his right side. Another scream. You treated my suffering like data, Dinah said. You watched me be tortured and you wrote it down in your neat handwriting. You participated in something so evil that I don't have words for it, and you felt nothing. Another strike through his left side. Nathaniel was sobbing now, begging incoherently. Now you feel something, Dinah said. Now you understand what pain is. Now you know what it's like to be helpless while someone hurts you and doesn't care about your suffering. She struck again and again, each puncture calculated to maximize pain without causing immediate death. She wanted him to suffer as she'd suffered. She wanted him to feel every moment. She wanted his death to last. After the 7th strike, Nathaniel stopped begging. He just hung from his bonds, bleeding from multiple wounds, fading in and out of consciousness. For 2 years, Dinah said quietly, you participated in my torture. For 2 years you watched and took notes and never once questioned whether what you were doing was evil. So I'm giving you 1 hour of what you gave me 730 days of. This is mercy, Nathaniel. This is me being kind. She drove the pitchfork through his chest, puncturing his right lung. Nathaniel gasped, unable to draw full breath, drowning in his own blood. Dinah left him there, hanging and dying, and went to find Margaret. Margaret Blackwood had locked herself in her bedroom on the 2nd floor. She'd pushed a heavy dresser against the door. She stood with a pistol in her shaking hands, pointing it at the door, waiting. Dinah tried the handle, found it locked, and called through the door. Margaret, you know I'm coming in. I'll shoot you, Margaret shrieked. I have a gun. I'll shoot you dead. Maybe, Dinah acknowledged, but I'm coming in anyway. She went to the kitchen, moving through the chaos of sick and fleeing guests, and retrieved the cast-iron pot Delilah used for laundry. She carried it up the stairs, approached Margaret's door, and smashed the pot against the wood. Once, twice. On the 3rd blow, the door frame splintered. On the 4th, the lock broke. On the 5th, the door burst open, pushing the dresser aside. Margaret fired her pistol. The shot went wild. Punching through the wall 2 feet to Dinah's left. Margaret tried to fire again, but she'd forgotten to cock the hammer. She fumbled with the weapon. Dinah crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed the pistol, wrenching it from Margaret's hands. She threw it aside and backhanded Margaret across the face. The white woman fell, crashing into her vanity, glass perfume bottles shattering. Get up, Dinah ordered. Margaret scrambled backward on the floor, leaving a trail of blood from a cut on her arm where she'd fallen on broken glass. Please, she begged, please, I never hurt you. I was kind to you. Dinah laughed, a sound without humor. Kind? You burned me with hot irons. You slapped me. You called me animal. You knew what your husband was doing to me in that barn, and you blamed me for it like I had any choice. You were never kind, Margaret. You were just another monster who happened to wear dresses. She grabbed Margaret by her hair and dragged her across the room to the fireplace. It was summer, so no fire burned, but the iron fire poker sat in its stand. Dinah released Margaret's hair, grabbed the poker and thrust it into the glowing coals of the kitchen fireplace visible through the wall grate. What are you doing? Margaret whispered. You burned me, Dinah said, so I'm going to burn you. She retrieved the hot iron poker, its tip glowing red. Margaret tried to crawl away. Dinah grabbed her ankle and dragged her back. This is for every time you burned me, Dinah said, and pressed the glowing poker against Margaret's arm. Margaret's scream echoed through the big house. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Dinah held the poker in place for 5 seconds, then removed it. A circular burn, red and blistering, marked Margaret's flesh. This is for every time you slapped me. Another burn on Margaret's other arm. This is for every time you called me animal. A burn on Margaret's shoulder. This is for every time you enjoyed my suffering. A burn on Margaret's side. Margaret was screaming continuously now, thrashing, trying to escape. Dinah held her down with one hand and continued the burning with the other. This is for my stolen dignity. Burn. This is for my stolen humanity. Burn. This is for every night I cried myself to sleep while you slept in your comfortable bed. Burn. After the 10th burn, Margaret stopped screaming. She'd passed out from pain and shock. Dinah stood, looked down at the unconscious woman covered in circular burns and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just emptiness. She left Margaret there, unconscious but alive for the moment, and went to check on the dining room. Morrison, Patterson and Whitfield were all dead, killed by the oleander poison. Their bodies lay where they'd collapsed, faces twisted in agony. Other guests had fled the property entirely, running into the night, spreading alarm. Some lay sick in various rooms, poisoned but not fatally. The enslaved people of the big house stood in stunned groups, witnessing the collapse of the order that had governed their entire lives. Delilah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Dinah descend the stairs. "Is it done?" the older woman asked. "Almost," Dinah said. "Where are Isaac, Samuel and Job?" "They fled to the quarters when the chaos started. They're hiding." "Good. They made their choice. They live." Dinah went outside. The sun had set, and full darkness was falling. She could hear screams in the distance as poisoned guests fled through the fields. She could smell smoke. Somewhere on the property, something was burning. Had one of the fleeing guests knocked over a lamp? Or had someone else decided this was the night for fire? She found Solomon near the slave quarters. He'd eliminated both night watchmen, not with poison, but with his blacksmith's hammer. Quick deaths, merciful compared to what the masters had received. "The main ones?" Solomon asked. "Cornelius dead, Marcus dead, Nathaniel dying in the barn, Margaret burned and unconscious in her bedroom, Morrison, Patterson and Whitfield dead from poison." Solomon nodded. "Then it's time to go." But Dinah shook her head. "Not yet. There's one more thing." She walked to the barn where Nathaniel hung dying. He was still alive, barely, breath rattling in his punctured lung. She looked at him dispassionately. "You're taking too long to die," she said. Then she took her hoe and swung it one final time. Nathaniel Blackwood's head separated from his body and hit the barn floor with a wet thump. The son of the monster of Mississippi died at 8:47 in the evening, decapitated in the same barn where he'd participated in monstrous experiments, his blood soaking into the same dirt where his victims had bled. Dinah returned to the big house one final time. She climbed the stairs to Margaret's bedroom. The woman was still unconscious, still breathing, despite her burns. Dinah stood over her, considering. She could kill Margaret now. It would be easy, one strike with the hoe, or she could drag the unconscious woman outside and let the community decide her fate. Or she could leave her here to wake up and face a world where her husband and son were dead, her home destroyed, her life shattered. Dinah chose the third option. Some punishments required living. She left Margaret breathing in her bedroom, descended the stairs, and walked out of Blackwood Manor Big House for the last time as an enslaved person. She found Solomon waiting with 2 horses, stolen from the Blackwood stables, saddled and ready. Delilah stood nearby with bundles of food and supplies. "Go," Delilah said. "Get far from here before the authorities come. We'll tell them you both died in the chaos, burned in the fire." "What fire?" Dinah asked. Delilah smiled grimly and gestured. Behind the big house, flames were rising from the kitchen building. Someone, probably one of the enslaved people deciding this was the moment, had set it alight. The fire was spreading to the main house through the covered walkway. The fire that destroyed Blackwood Manor, Delilah said. "The fire that killed so many people, the fire that covered all evidence. Now go." Dinah embraced Delilah, then Seraphina, who'd appeared from the slave quarters. The old woman pressed a bundle into Dinah's hands. "Protection herbs," she said, "and poison, in case you need it on the road. The ancestors go with you, child." "You did what needed doing." Dinah and Solomon mounted their stolen horses. They turned north toward freedom, toward the Underground Railroad station 15 miles away, toward the rest of their lives. Behind them, Blackwood Manor burned. The big house that had stood for 32 years, built with stolen labor, site of countless cruelties, began collapsing into flames. Margaret Blackwood woke from unconsciousness to find herself surrounded by fire, her bedroom filling with smoke. She managed to crawl to a window and scream for help before the smoke overcame her. Some enslaved people rushed to save her. Others watched the house burn and did nothing. Margaret was pulled from the burning building, horribly burned, her husband and son dead, her life destroyed. She would survive physically, but would spend the rest of her days in the care of relatives, her mind broken by what she'd endured and what she'd lost. The fire burned all night. By morning of July 24th, Blackwood Manor was a smoking ruin. The big house was destroyed. 8 white people were confirmed dead: Cornelius Blackwood, Nathaniel Blackwood, Marcus Thornton, Edward Morrison, Richard Patterson, Thomas Whitfield, and 2 guests who'd been too sick from poison to flee the fire. Margaret Blackwood survived, but barely. The 2 night watchmen were found dead with crushed skulls, and Dinah and Solomon were nowhere to be found. The discovery of the bodies at Blackwood Manor sent shockwaves through Mississippi. By mid-morning of July 24th, riders had spread the alarm throughout Wilkinson County. By afternoon, the news had reached Natchez, then Vicksburg, then Jackson. By evening, telegraph messages were spreading the story across the South: a slave rebellion, mass poisoning, 8 white people dead. The plantation burned. 2 slaves missing and presumed responsible. Sheriff Thomas Harrington arrived at Blackwood Manor with 20 armed men by 9 in the morning. He surveyed the carnage with growing horror. The burned ruins of the big house still smoldered. Bodies lay in various locations. Cornelius in what had been the dining room, his corpse partially burned, but still showing signs of violent convulsions. Marcus Thornton's body near the table, throat cut, surrounded by dried blood. Nathaniel Blackwood's headless corpse in the barn, his severed head several feet away. Morrison, Patterson, and Whitfield dead in positions suggesting they'd been trying to flee. The 2 guests who died in the fire were burned beyond recognition, the night watchman with crushed skulls. And Margaret Blackwood, rescued from the fire, lay in a guest cabin, tended by a doctor who'd been summoned from Woodville. She was incoherent, babbling about burns and revenge and the slave woman with the hoe. Sheriff Harrington interviewed the surviving enslaved people of Blackwood Manor. They told a carefully coordinated story. The feast had been proceeding normally. Then Master Cornelius had suddenly fallen ill. Others became sick. There was chaos and panic. Someone knocked over lamps, starting the fire. In the confusion, 2 slaves, Dinah and Solomon, had fled on horses. No one knew where they went. No one had seen them poison anyone or kill anyone. They just disappeared in the chaos. The sheriff didn't believe a word of it, but he couldn't prove otherwise. The enslaved people had clearly agreed on their story, and they stuck to it under interrogation. Delilah, questioned specifically because she'd prepared the food, claimed ignorance. "I cooked the food same as always," she said. "I don't know why people got sick. Maybe the meat was bad. Maybe the wine was spoiled. I just cook what I'm told to cook." The sheriff examined the kitchen, or what remained of it after the fire. Any evidence of poison preparation had been destroyed. The wine bottles had shattered in the heat. The serving dishes had melted or broken. There was no physical evidence linking anyone to deliberate poisoning. But the testimony of Margaret Blackwood, once she became coherent enough to speak, painted a clear picture. It was Dinah. she whispered from her bed of pain. "The animal tender. She did this. She poisoned them. She killed my husband. She killed my son. She burned me. She did it all." Sheriff Harrington asked why. Margaret explained about the breeding experiments, the torture, the 2 years of suffering Cornelius had inflicted on Dinah. The sheriff's face went pale as he listened. Some of the details were too horrific for him to write in his official report. When he filed his account with the county authorities, he described only disciplinary measures that may have been excessive, rather than the full truth of what had been done to Dinah. A bounty was immediately posted, $500 for Dinah and Solomon, dead or alive. Professional slave catchers were summoned from across Mississippi and Louisiana. Bloodhounds were brought in to track their scent. Patrols scoured the roads north toward the Free States, but Dinah and Solomon had a 12-hour head start, and they used it well. They rode north through the night of July 23rd, abandoning the horses after 10 miles and continuing on foot through swamps and forests where dogs couldn't easily track them. They traveled only at night, navigating by the North Star that had guided countless freedom seekers before them. They hid during daylight in dense vegetation, in hollow trees, in abandoned cabins. On the third night, they reached the Underground Railroad station, a barn owned by Quakers who asked no questions. They were hidden in a false-bottom wagon covered with hay and transported north to the next station. From there, they moved through a network of safe houses, always traveling at night, always one step ahead of pursuit. By early August, Dinah and Solomon crossed into Tennessee. By late August, they were in Kentucky, crossing the Ohio River under cover of darkness. By September, they reached Ohio, free territory, though still not truly safe because of the Fugitive Slave Act that allowed slave catchers to operate in free states. They kept moving. Pennsylvania, New York. By October of 1857, they reached Canada, where slavery was illegal and slave catchers had no authority. They settled in a small community of other freedom seekers near Toronto, using assumed names, building a life. Solomon found work as a blacksmith. Dinah found work as a veterinary assistant, using her skills with animals. They married in a small ceremony, their union recognized by law for the first time. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who were born free, who would never know chains. But Dinah never truly left Mississippi behind. She had nightmares for the rest of her life. Waking up screaming, reliving the experiments, she bore physical scars from the torture and psychological scars that never fully healed. She never spoke of what happened at Blackwood Manor except once, years later, to an abolitionist who was collecting testimonies of slavery's horrors. Her account was published anonymously in 1863. Causing outrage in the North and denial in the South, Solomon understood her trauma because he carried his own. They helped each other survive, built a life together, found moments of happiness amid the lingering pain. They lived to see the end of slavery, lived to see the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865. Solomon died in 1878 at age 57, a free man who'd fought for his freedom. Dinah lived until 1892, dying at age 69, having spent 35 years of her life in freedom. Meanwhile, back in Mississippi, the Blackwood Manor massacre became legendary. The initial investigation concluded that Dinah had poisoned multiple people and killed several others, then fled with Solomon's help. Margaret Blackwood's testimony provided the motive. The physical evidence, what remained after the fire, supported the conclusion. But the exact details became confused and exaggerated in retelling. Some accounts claimed Dinah had killed 20 people. Others said she'd burned down multiple plantations. Still others claimed she'd led an armed slave rebellion involving dozens of participants. The truth was both simpler and more terrible than the legends. One woman, subjected to unimaginable torture, had fought back with intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. She'd killed 8 people, the men who tortured her, the men who'd witnessed and approved, the man who'd whipped her on command. She'd burned the symbol of their power, and she'd escaped. The massacre terrified plantation owners across the South. If it could happen at Blackwood Manor, one of the wealthiest, most secure plantations in Mississippi, it could happen anywhere. The paranoia that already existed in slave-owning society intensified dramatically. In the immediate aftermath, enslaved people across the region faced collective punishment. Plantations increased security measures. Overseers became more brutal, trying to prevent similar uprisings through increased terror. Slave patrols multiplied. Laws were passed, making it even more illegal to teach slaves to read, to allow them to gather, to provide them with any knowledge that might lead to resistance. But underneath the increased oppression, something else was happening. The story of Dinah spread through the enslaved community. In whispered conversations in slave quarters across the South, people told each other about the woman who'd fought back, the woman who'd killed her torturers, the woman who'd escaped. The story became a spiritual. There are no written records of the exact lyrics, but former slaves interviewed in the 1930s remembered songs about Dinah who killed the master and the woman with the hoe. These spirituals served dual purposes. They were coded messages about resistance, and they were sources of hope. If one woman could fight back successfully, others could too. The Blackwood Manor massacre also influenced the abolitionist movement. When Dinah's anonymous testimony was published in 1863, it became one of the most widely circulated accounts of slavery's brutality. Abolitionist speakers quoted it in lectures. It was reprinted in newspapers across the North. It helped shift public opinion, providing concrete evidence of the horrors of slavery beyond the simple fact of bondage. Some historians have argued that the Blackwood Manor massacre and similar acts of resistance contributed to the growing tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. Slave owners feared their human property more with each incident of rebellion. They demanded harsher laws, more federal support for slave catching, more concessions from free states. These demands alienated Northern moderates and strengthened abolitionist arguments. Whether Dinah's actions directly influenced the course of history is debatable. But they certainly had ripple effects that extended far beyond one burning plantation in Mississippi. The Blackwood family never recovered. Margaret Blackwood lived until 1868, but she was a broken woman, physically and mentally destroyed by the burns and the trauma. The plantation lands were sold to pay debts. The family name became associated with the scandal, the experiments, the massacre. Blackwood descendants who survived changed their names to escape the stigma. The enslaved people of Blackwood Manor were sold to various buyers after the massacre. Some ended up on plantations nearby. Others were sold south to the cotton fields of the deep Mississippi Delta. A few were sold north to Kentucky and Tennessee. None of them ever revealed what they knew about how the massacre really happened. The code of silence held. Isaac, Samuel, and Job, the three drivers who'd held Dinah down during experiments but whom she'd spared, all lived to see emancipation. Isaac died a free man in 1870. Samuel struggled with guilt for his role in Dinah's torture and drank himself to death in 1869. Job became a preacher after freedom, dedicating his life to atonement, dying in 1883. Delilah the cook was sold to a plantation in Louisiana after the massacre, where she continued her work in kitchens. She lived to see freedom in 1865 and died in 1872. In her final years, she told people that she'd once helped poison a master, though no one believed her. Seraphina the conjure woman died in 1859, 2 years after the massacre. The enslaved community whispered that she'd chosen her time of death, that she'd used her knowledge of herbs to ensure a peaceful end, that her spirit joined the ancestors she'd served all her life. And what of the larger implications? What does the Blackwood Manor massacre teach us? First, it reveals the depth of brutality that existed under slavery. The experiments Cornelius Blackwood performed on Dinah were documented in multiple sources. Margaret's testimony, the anonymous account published in 1863, court records. These were not isolated incidents. Medical experimentation on enslaved people was widespread in the antebellum South. The father of modern gynecology, Dr. James Marion Sims, developed his surgical techniques by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia. Countless other doctors, scientists, and plantation owners used enslaved bodies as experimental subjects, justified by pseudo-scientific racism that denied black humanity. Second, the massacre demonstrates that resistance to slavery was constant and varied. The popular narrative of slavery often portrays enslaved people as either passive victims or participants in large-scale rebellions like Nat Turner's. But resistance took many forms: daily acts of sabotage, escape, suicide, violence against overseers and masters, and carefully planned revenge like Dinah's. Most of these acts of resistance were never documented or were deliberately erased from the historical record. The Blackwood Manor Massacre survived in memory because it was too large to hide. Third, the story illuminates the impossible moral position of enslaved people. Dinah killed 8 people. By any legal definition, she committed murder. But can murder exist in a context where one group of people claims legal ownership of another? When the law itself is evil, are violations of that law immoral? These questions troubled abolitionists then and should trouble us now. Dinah chose violence because every legal avenue was closed to her. She had no courts to appeal to, no authorities who would protect her, no way to escape except through violence or death. Fourth, the massacre reveals the paranoia that underlay the entire slave system. Slave owners lived in constant fear of the people they oppressed. They knew their wealth was built on stolen labor and stolen lives. They knew that enslaved people had every reason to hate them. This fear manifested in brutal punishments designed to terrorize, in elaborate security systems, in laws restricting any activities that might lead to organized resistance. The Blackwood Manor Massacre confirmed every slave owner's worst nightmare, that the people they'd tortured might one day fight back. Finally, Dinah's story is a reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. The cruelty of Cornelius Blackwood, who justified monstrous torture as scientific inquiry. The cruelty of Nathaniel, who participated in his father's experiments. The cruelty of Margaret, who blamed victims for their own suffering. The cruelty of an entire system that allowed such horrors to exist and protected them with law. But also the courage of Dinah, who survived 2 years of torture without breaking completely, who planned revenge with intelligence and patience, who risked everything for justice. The courage of Seraphina, who passed on knowledge that could be used for resistance. The courage of Delilah, who helped poison the masters despite knowing she'd be punished if discovered. The courage of Solomon, who chose to fight alongside Dinah. The courage of the enslaved community that protected the truth of what happened. The Blackwood Manor Massacre happened 168 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant. It teaches us that oppression has costs that eventually come due. It teaches us that humans will resist even the most brutal systems of control. It teaches us that cruelty breeds violence, that torture creates monsters, that injustice cannot stand forever. It teaches us that the people in power should fear the people they oppress, because eventually the oppressed might decide they have nothing left to lose. And it reminds us that the history we're taught in schools is often sanitized, that the full truth of American slavery was even worse than most people imagine, that resistance was more widespread and more violent than comfortable narratives acknowledge. Dinah's name, her real name, not the one her masters called her, has been lost to history. We don't know what her mother called her when she was born. We don't know what name she gave herself when she reached freedom. The historical record refers to her only as Dinah, slave of Cornelius Blackwood, fugitive murderer. But in the whispered stories of enslaved communities, in the spirituals that carried coded messages, in the legacy of resistance that helped end slavery, she lives on, not as a murderer, but as a freedom fighter, not as a monster, but as a woman who refused to accept monstrous treatment. Her story is one that American history tried to erase, but it deserves to be remembered, told, and learned from, because if we forget what was done to people like Dinah, we risk allowing such horrors to happen again. And if we forget that people like Dinah fought back, we lose understanding of how resistance works, how oppressed people find power, how justice can emerge even from the darkest circumstances. The monster of Mississippi, Cornelius Blackwood, created a monster in Dinah when he tortured her beyond endurance. But she was not a monster. She was a human being who'd been treated as something less than human, who reclaimed her humanity through violence because no other path was available. She was a woman who killed her torturers and escaped to freedom. She was a woman who lived to see slavery end. She was a woman who bore the scars of her trauma for the rest of her life, but also bore children who were born free. She was one of thousands of enslaved people who fought back against the system that claimed to own them. Most of their names are lost. Most of their actions went unrecorded. But collectively, their resistance helped destroy slavery. This is not a comfortable story. It's not a story with easy morals. It's a story about torture and revenge, about violence meeting violence, about the terrible costs of oppression and the terrible prices of resistance. But it's a true story, and true stories, especially uncomfortable ones, are the ones we most need to remember. If you've read this far, you understand now why this history matters. You understand why we can't sanitize the past or pretend slavery was anything less than a system of unspeakable brutality. You understand why resistance took the forms it did, why people like Dinah chose violence, why justice sometimes came covered in blood. The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge? Do we acknowledge that the legacy of slavery still shapes America today? Do we recognize that the same structures of oppression that allowed the Blackwood plantation to exist have evolved into new forms? Do we commit to ensuring that nothing like this can ever happen again? Or do we treat this as just another shocking story from the past, disconnected from present reality, safe to consume as entertainment without changing anything? Dinah would want us to remember, to learn, to resist oppression in whatever forms it takes today, to never accept systems that treat some humans as less than human, to fight back when necessary, even when the cost is high. That's her legacy. That's the lesson of Blackwood Manor. Never again, never forget, never stop fighting for freedom.